In this presentation, we're going to talk about developing interventions and programs to facilitate generalization. And also, what can we do to ensure that any gains from our intervention are going to be maintained across time? We call that durability of behavior change. When we talk about generalization, we are usually referring to the extent to which gains or improvements in behavior in one setting or with one group of people or person are going to generalize to other situations or to other people. And that's basically what we're covering here. There are some different types of generalization, though, and in some situations, one type is more important than another. They're all important, and they're all things that we need to consider. We'll be talking about each one of these individually. First is stimulus generalization, and then response generalization, and then something called resistance to extinction. Each one of these involve using different types of interventions to facilitate them, and it's important to know what we need to be doing to ensure that these types of generalizations are going to occur. Because, back to stimulus generalization, when we learn to differentiate, then that's called discrimination. Discrimination is sort of the opposite of generalization. And for example, when you learn a concept of the concept dog, then you're able to identify the critical features, whatever makes a dog, and you can identify a dog if it's a Great Dane or if it's a Chihuahua. They look very different from one another, yet we're able to recognize each one of those as dogs. That's really what's happening with learning. We learn to identify the critical feature or the defining features of something. And through our teaching and through differentially reinforcing learners, we're teaching them to generalize correctly or to identify members of a concept. Response generalization is when we teach one behavior in response to a situation, and then after that, other behaviors increase. Similar behaviors, or it can be something that is a similar form, or usually what I see is it's a similar function. The example we give here is a child calls his father's father, grandfather, or papa or granddad. Those are all ways of referring to his father's father, but we learn different ways of doing that. This is really important because this will determine whether or not we can adapt to different situations. You see this in communication a lot with kids with autism. I've been involved with using the picture exchange communication system with young children for many years. Some of the opposition sometimes comes if a kid is doing some vocalizations or verbalizations, and we want to introduce using pictures. People say, well, don't want him to stop talking. I want him to speak and use words and not pictures. Time and time again, what I've seen is when kids start using pictures to communicate, at the same time they start using their words more. What happens is they learn communication, and then response generalization occurs, and they start using other forms of communication. Also, another thing we look for that's related to response generalization is we call it, communication breakdown repairs. It's kind of an awkward name, but that's the way it's referred to. And that is when someone attempts to communicate, the message isn't understood, and then the person uses another form of communication. We all do that all the time. We constantly monitor people with whom we're trying to communicate. If I'm up in front of the class talking and I look out at you guys and I look and see some blank faces, then I need to explain that a different way. That's the same thing. That's another example of response generalization. And finally, we've got something called resistance to extinction. Now, this is the extent to which a behavior will continue to occur when it's not being reinforced, or realistically, when it's being reinforced very infrequently. This is what we're going for with behaviors that we want to teach. We want to build resistance to extinction. We want the students or our learners to continue to use this skill even when it's not reinforced every time. The example is if somebody buys a winning lottery ticket, they might continue to buy tickets, or even if they hear about somebody else winning, they might continue to buy tickets. Another one that we're going to use is a slot machine. I like this example because it demonstrates how you actually build resistance to extinction, and we'll come back to that. So those are the three types of generalization that it's important to understand if we want to change behavior and have it be useful behavior that's going to occur across situations and continue across time. Here's just some other examples of stimulus generalization, response generalization, and resistance to extinction. Take a few minutes and read through them and make sure that you understand why it's an example of that particular form of generalization. And if you don't see why, then just write down a question and email me. Okay, how do we get this to occur? Well, there are different approaches. Generalization is something that we have to plan for. So we call this systematically arranging for newly learned behavior to occur in situations other than those in which it was originally taught. Situations can refer to different kinds of instructional situations. So, for instance, if we initially implement an intervention in reading instruction, for instance, we teach the student to self-monitor and increase on-task behavior during reading, the next step might be to generalize to math instruction and then to independent work. So that would be generalization across instructional activities. Another type of situation might be across people. So, in other words, I visit a lot of schools and situations where a student might work really well with a particular paraprofessional or with a teacher, but then when another person comes in, the kid is very disruptive. In that case, we'd be looking at generalization across people. And then we also look at generalization across places or settings. This can be different locations within the same setting, like in the school, the gymnasium, the classroom, the playground, or it could be generalization across school and home and the community. When we talk about maintenance, we're talking about building resistance to extinction. Here we're talking about how do we develop our interventions so that we are building resistance to extinction, and how are we facilitating the students' improvements continuing across time. There's some important things that we need to learn to make this happen as well. There are different tactics we can use. One that's used often, I call it, well, not I didn't invent this, it's called train and hope. In other words, we teach a skill and we just hope that it generalizes and maintains. Fortunately, with typically developing kids, this is often all you have to do. You don't have to worry about generalization with most students because it just happens. When they learn a skill, they have a few examples, they can apply it to different situations and with different people. However, with kids on the autism spectrum, and certainly with kids with developmental disabilities, and to a large extent kids with emotional and behavioral issues, whether or not they're formally identified or not, have a lot of problems with generalization. For those students, we're going to need to build in extra things to ensure that these forms of generalization are occurring. One that I use a lot is called sequential modification. I like to start an intervention, if it's a really intensive one, in one setting, and first of all, that allows me to do some problem solving and fine-tune the intervention, determine what needs to be changed. Also, once we see improvement in one setting, it's a lot easier at that point to introduce the intervention in a second and third and then fourth setting. The behavior changes much more quickly because the students already learned it in one setting. So I will start it usually where I have the most cooperation or where there's the most need. And that usually makes it a lot easier to implement something in settings where people are less on board, especially if they see the improvement in the first setting. There are a number of active strategies that we use, and we're going to talk about each one of these individually. Active strategies are actually the things that you would use when you do sequential modification. So it's not separate, but it's something that you'd use in conjunction with changing things sequentially across settings. The first one we've talked about already. We look at natural consequences or natural maintaining contingencies. Now we know that one of the reasons we don't rely on these exclusively is sometimes they are not offering a rich enough reinforcement schedule or intensive enough reinforcement for new behaviors to occur. But that we can use other reinforcers temporarily and then use a system like DRH to fade out that level of reinforcement. So it helps if we know what motivates a student, and can we look for natural kinds of existing reinforcers to capitalize on. Sometimes it's doing things to make them more obvious for a little period of time or for a shorter period of time. So we look at existing reinforcers. If they are not adequate to support the new behavior, then we can add in some extra reinforcement. The important thing there is systematically fading that reinforcement out. And you've learned some different ways to do that through studying differential reinforcement approaches. Another strategy using task-related reinforcement or something called logical consequences. In other words, if you finish your work early, if it's independent work time, then you can have free time to do something you choose. Having the free time is a logical, natural consequence of finishing your work early. Another approach that's important is designing or developing instruction and teaching functional skills. We've already talked about this, but we called it alternative behaviors. Alternative behaviors are behaviors we teach that lead to the same function or outcome as the challenging behaviors. So if we teach behaviors that are useful, in other words, they automatically result in a reinforcer that the student is after. For example, if a kid is acting out to get support or help from the teacher, we teach that student to ask for help or assistance. That leads to a natural reinforcer of getting help. Also, teaching socially valid behaviors. These are behaviors that are viewed as important by other people. Sometimes in schools we call these teacher-pleasing behaviors, but they're not limited to school. These are things that you can use in the community. For example, in a grocery store, teaching the appropriate way to ask someone for help or help locating something, and then thanking the person when you're finished, when they've helped you. Those are important socially valid behaviors that will also result in natural reinforcement. There are a lot of examples in the research literature of people using natural maintaining consequences. There was a really classic study done back in 1980 by a group of folks, and they identified behaviors that typically developing children used with their peers. So they came up with things like sharing, and another thing they labeled as verbally organizing play. In other words, one kid would say what the rules were or state what the game was. Another was asking assistance or appropriate ways to get affection from adults, and then something called rough and tumble. It's like the idea that kids can play and know where to set limits without going too far. That was a problem they observed in some kids, is some kids would push the limits and make another child angry. So it was teaching kids how to identify when to stop. They taught these skills to some kids who were having difficulty and saw immediate improvement, and they didn't use artificial reinforcement. These new behaviors they taught were maintained by natural reinforcers. A few years after that, Seville and Fox used the same intervention. They taught those skills to young children with autism, and they saw some similar kinds of results. In a similar kind of study, Grubard, Rosenberg, and Miller took a group of kids with emotional and behavioral disorders who had frequent negative interaction with teachers, and they taught them appropriate ways to recruit or obtain positive interactions from teachers. So some of the things we've been talking about, how to request help, how to ask for clarification, thanking the teacher after help was given. And when they taught these things, those behaviors led to more positive interactions with the kids, or with the teachers, between the kids and the teachers. What's usually helpful here is if you use a functional behavior assessment to identify the function of the challenging behavior, and like we've been saying all along, you teach the student a more appropriate way to meet that same need or to obtain that same outcome. So that's really what they were doing in this study. Another strategy for facilitating generalization is using a sufficient number of exemplars or examples. In the literature they call them exemplars. I don't really know why. Examples makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? There's an approach called general case programming that will go into a lot more detail when you take TLSE 560, those of you that will. But for now, it's when you use a range of examples. So if you're going to teach a concept or a skill, they say you have to define the instructional universe. What that means is you look at the range of examples that someone would encounter in the natural world. For example, what's an appropriate response to a greeting if you're teaching that? Well, first of all, you've got to come up with what are different ways that a student may be greeted by other people. And you have to use those different examples in your teaching. So you'd have to have a lot of examples because there are a lot of appropriate ways you can greet someone. On the other hand, if you're teaching someone what to do when you see a stop sign or when the person sees a stop sign, there's only really one or maybe a few examples. Sometimes at a shopping mall they might be smaller or kind of weird, but a stop sign looks the same in this country no matter where you go. So you would only have a few basic examples to teach the stop sign. When you have multiple examples, you use both positive examples and negative examples. We've already talked about this when we talked about social skills. Positive examples are different ways that you can appropriately use that skill. For example, apologizing. Positive examples would be, say, 5 or 6 different ways that it's appropriate to apologize for a peer. Negative examples are non-examples, or this is not appropriately apologizing. When you use positive examples and you juxtapose them with negative examples, it makes it very clear to the person what is and is not an example of what's being learned. I like to start out with negative examples that are really almost funny because they're so extremely not what we're looking for. And then always end with negative examples that are kind of in a gray area. When you do that, it really teaches students to discriminate different situations very well. If you start out with those really gray examples, though, it's going to be too hard. But by gradually introducing them later on in learning, it really drives home the concept and helps people define the boundaries. When you use multiple exemplar training, you have to decide what kind of generalization are you focusing on. Are you looking at examples across, or are you looking at generalization across people or across situations? Usually I like to start with one type of generalization and then introduce another one later. So for example, if the kid has issues with working with different people, I might start out with different people in the same setting. Then once I have some success with generalization across people, then I'll start working in across settings. You have to use your history with the student to gauge how quickly you can do this. With some kids, you can do this really quickly, and you can even do 2 or 3 types of generalization at the same time. With other students, you can't. If I were making some changes and I saw the student improvement stopping, I would probably back up to the last place where the student was successful and then introduce the changes more slowly. How many examples are sufficient? Well, usually I like to have at least 5 or 6. But for some things, if there's a huge range in what the student will encounter, you might need more. You might need 15 examples. A good way sometimes to introduce additional examples is to use video. It makes it a lot easier if you can just show a video of different examples. You don't have to act everything out. I use combinations of real-life role play, pictures, and video all the time. Another approach that some people talk about is they call it training loosely. And when I first read about this, I didn't really understand what it meant. And oh yeah, train loosely. So you wear like sweats and a t-shirt when you train or when you teach. The idea is that you let natural variability into your teaching situations. Those of you who have been involved with discrete trial instruction for kids with autism, you have seen a very highly controlled learning situation. And I used to do that kind of instruction. It's very highly controlled. You do everything exactly the same way every time. And for some kids, when you do that, you see very fast learning. The problem is, it is also learning that's very fragile. If you change anything about that situation, you're going to see the student's performance really drop. So by introducing change, we'll work at one table today, the next day we'll work at a different table. I used to have kids standing up to do things, or we'd move around, we'd do things differently, we'd face different ways, I'd use different materials. Using those kinds of changes is going to facilitate generalization in a very natural way. And it's a really good way, I believe, to introduce generalization. Some other things you can consider, something called incidental teaching. That means that if you're working on a skill, take advantage of any naturally occurring opportunity to use that skill and use it as a teaching situation. For things like communication skills and social skills, this is critical. You have to prompt students to use those skills in the middle of situations that are naturally occurring and then reinforce them once they occur. You simply won't see generalization with communication or social skills unless you do that. You can also build skills into natural routines. Have a time and place where the person's going to use a skill. Teach them to perform that skill naturally in the presence of that situation. This is also a really natural way to build in different learning opportunities as well. Another approach is called indiscriminable contingencies. The idea here is these are with indiscriminable contingencies, we want to make reinforcement less predictable. Again, these are things we've really talked about before, but we talked about them in different ways. One of the ways that we build resistance to extinction is to use intermittent reinforcement. And that means we fade the schedule of reinforcement. New behaviors are learned most quickly when the learner is reinforced every single time the behavior occurs. So you get really fast acquisition that way. However, when you do that, the behavior is very dependent on reinforcement. In other words, you have to keep reinforcing. If you stop suddenly, the behavior stops. So using reinforcement, we call it continuous reinforcement when we reinforce every time. That is a good thing to do in the very beginning. Let's say you're teaching a communication skill to a child with autism, or you're teaching a coping strategy to a kid with emotional and behavioral disorders. Every time the kid uses that skill, you reinforce it. However, after the skill's established, you start fading out that reinforcement. With DRH, remember, we start requiring more and more behavior before you reinforce. Well, you do the same thing here, only we use a different schedule depending on whether it's the number of times the behavior occurs or it's some interval of time. If it's something like a communication skill, we might start out by reinforcing it every time, and then we might use some extra reinforcement every other time, and then every third time, and then every fourth time. That's called a ratio schedule of reinforcement. If it's a behavior that's based on time, like something like on-task behavior, we might reinforce the student for being on task for 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and then we go to reinforcing the student for being on task for 10 minutes, and then for 15 minutes, and then for 30 minutes. That's a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Later on, we want to introduce some variability or some unpredictability. So we use a variable ratio or variable interval schedule. For example, we might reinforce the student on average every 15 times he does a math problem. But sometimes it might be 20, sometimes it might be 10, but it averages out to about every 15 problems, and then maybe averages out to every 30 problems. With communication skill, you might reinforce the kid every time. Then you might go to, on average, every fourth time. The idea here is that the variability makes it a little less predictable. Let me give you an example here of how schedules of reinforcement affect behavior. I mentioned before the slot machine. Well, think about this. A soda machine and a slot machine are similar in that in both of those you insert money, you push a button, and there's some kind of outcome or reinforcer. In the case of the soda machine, the reinforcer is a can of pop or can of soda, depending on where you are from in the U.S. We call them drinks in North Carolina. But you get that every single time. If you push the button and you don't get a can of soda, an extinction burst is going to happen immediately. You're going to shake the machine, pound the button a little harder, maybe, kick it, depending on how badly you want something to drink. If you're really thirsty, you might put money in a second time. And you're really going to shake the machine if it doesn't work the second time. It's very rare that someone would actually put money in a third time. I mean, that just wouldn't happen. I mean, you're going to say, oh, it's broken, doesn't work. Okay, now that's because that behavior is maintained on a continuous schedule of reinforcement, which is very vulnerable to extinction. Now let's consider a different example, a slot machine. Go to any casino and you're going to see people putting money in those machines, pushing a button, lights flash, nothing happens. They put more money in, lights flash, nothing happens. They put more money in, lights flash, nothing happens. After a while, they might get a few coins, and very irregularly, they get a big payoff. People that run those casinos understand schedules of reinforcement really well. They're actually engineered so that if you're staying in that area and you're there for any period of time, you're going to see someone else get a payoff because they know that's what keeps people putting money in those machines. The fact that you keep your money in a little cup and they take theirs away in an armored car kind of tells you who the real winner is there. But that is a good example of how schedules of reinforcement really affect our behavior. So if you want behavior to maintain, use intermittent reinforcement. You start out with a fixed schedule, whether it's ratio or interval. Then you move to variable schedules, and you can actually space them out pretty far. A variable ratio schedule of reinforcement will produce behavior that will occur for a very long time without reinforcement. It's actually why many challenging behaviors are very hard to reduce using extinction alone when you really think about it. Um, Challenging behavior does not pay off every time it occurs. Kids have learned to persist and to keep engaging in a behavior over and over again, and then finally it pays off for them. So, a lot of challenging behaviors are maintained by variable ratio schedules of reinforcement. That's why it's very hard to change behavior using extinction and not something else. Response-dependent fading of an intervention is something we've already talked about in the examples we used of DRL and DRH. We are changing a criteria for reinforcement based on the student's success. So we're using the student and the student's performance as a way to tell us when it's time to change the criteria for reinforcement. So the most effective way to change a schedule of reinforcement is to base it on the student's performance and not just the passage of time. Often I'll see people, well, I'm going to fade the reinforcement schedule. Every week I'm going to increase the requirement by 5 responses. Well, that might be good, that might not. It's more important to base it on the student's performance and to fade the reinforcement at the speed that's appropriate for that student. Also, gradually delaying reinforcement is another tactic. You want to start out with immediate reinforcement because that produces the most rapid change in behavior. Over time, though, we want to have the student performing the behavior for longer periods of time to get the payoff. So we might start out with a payoff, if we're using, say, a simple token program. At the end of every hour, the student exchanges tokens, and then maybe at the end of the morning, and then at the end of the day. Then we might go to the student exchanging points just at the end of the day, and then we might go to, say, a couple of times a week, and then we might end up with the student exchanging tokens or points for backup reinforcers at the end of the week. Very few kids are going to be successful if you just start out at the end of the week, yet a lot of people develop programs and start them out just that way. A good example of using indiscriminable contingencies was in a study done by one of my friends, Jim Fox, back in 1990. He was working with a child who refused to wear a seatbelt, and he hid his mother and his siblings. He was a child with disabilities. So he developed a program to help the family out, and he used differential reinforcement for wearing the seatbelt and not hitting or not having tantrums. Initially, the kid earned tokens at different places along the trip. So if he got to a certain point and he had worn his seatbelt and had not hit anyone, he would earn a token. And there were 6 different places between home and school where he could earn a token. Once he was successful, they faded it so there were 5 places he would earn a token, and then 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1. And then finally, he was just reinforced for going the whole trip and not having any incidents while he wearing his seatbelt, and there were no tokens. So they very systematically changed the plan based on the student's success, so it was response-based, and they faded the number of points along the way where the student could earn a token, and then they eliminated tokens altogether, and the reinforcement plan was successful. Other people had tried using similar approaches, and the mother actually told him, yeah, we tried reinforcement plans and they just don't work with my son. What had happened is people just started out trying to reinforce him for going the whole trip wearing his seatbelt. And that was an example of starting where you want the student to be and not where the student is. So fading reinforcement and understanding why you do it is an important part of making these interventions successful. Hopefully this has been useful information to you. There's some other aspects we want to consider. Another is using common stimuli. So if we're going to teach a skill that's going to be performed in different settings, is there some aspect or something in common about those settings, and can we make that an important cue for engaging in the behavior? Sometimes we can do that by taking elements of a natural environment and bringing them into a teaching situation. For example, when I was working with young children with autism that had never been in stores or never helped with purchasing, I started out teaching them certain behaviors by bringing things into the classroom they would see in the store. So I brought some items in, we set up a table, and we went through the line. We practiced all those things with some of those stimuli that were from the natural environment. And then once the student learned the behaviors, we actually went out into purchasing environments and stores and started using some of the skills. Because these kids had such severe behavior problems, it was important to do things to minimize the likelihood they were going to have problems before we went out in the community. Another thing you can do is you can use peers as a form of common stimuli. I did this when I worked with kids with emotional behavioral disorders, and I was going to mainstream them back into general ed classrooms. I had kids from the general ed classrooms come in and do peer tutoring and also serving as peer buddies. Then when my students went into the general ed classroom, the presence of those peers was a common element with the appropriate behavior they had learned in the self-contained classroom. Some other strategies, one important one is self-management. We call self-management a form of mediation, or it's a way to mediate generalization. So teaching self-observation, self-recording, and self-reinforcement, self-evaluation, teaching those skills can make it much more likely that students are going to generalize behaviors and skills across settings and across people. It's probably one of the most used ones for a number of reasons. I like it because it's teaching the student to take responsibility for her or his own behavior. Some other approaches that people use is just having kids verbalize the behavior and then having them actually record their performance and then report to someone else. A variation of this is check in, check out. It sort of works the same way. These are all different forms of self-monitoring with someone else sort of supervising and checking up on the kid. Some other approaches that have been successful is teaching typically developing peers how to prompt or how to facilitate appropriate behavior in kids with disabilities. I've done this a number of times, especially if I was teaching social skills. I would have some other kids work with me, and if a student had issues with responding to greetings or with answering questions, I would set some kids up to help out my students by going and asking them questions, and then I would teach them different ways to prompt responses. It's a good way just to get typically developing kids involved with special needs kids as well. You typically do this, you follow the same steps that you would with the self-management program, only you have the kids without disabilities just record, usually at the end of the day, how many times did they facilitate or prompt, and then how did the student respond. I've sometimes done this while I was also teaching self-management skills to the kids with special needs.